One of the most interesting things about our ability to process information is how good we are at selectively attending to certain stimuli and filtering out everything else that we don't care about. And it is pretty remarkable when you think about it because we're just being overwhelmed with sensory information all the time, and yet we can cut through it all and attend to the thing that we care about most. Psychologists have sometimes referred to this as the cocktail party phenomenon. Imagine yourself in a very large room full of people. There's a lot of conversation going on. There's a loud buzz in the background. There are voices all around you. You have people standing very close to you, behind you, on the side of you. And yet, in this situation, you can stand there and have a conversation with an individual who isn't any closer to you than other individuals having their own conversations, and have it successfully take place. This is what selective attention is all about. Now, there are some things that will grab our attention and force us to attend to it. For example, if you're in this large room full of people and you hear somebody, 15 feet away, mention your name, even though you weren't paying attention, this kind of drags your ears in that direction. So how do we do it? Psychologists have come up with a couple of different models to explain how selective attention works, and that's what we're going to talk about in this PowerPoint presentation. Before we get there, however, I want to point out one slight downside to selective attention. There's something known as change blindness. Because we're so good at filtering out everything else that we're not consciously paying attention to, we may miss some very profound changes in our surroundings. This inability to notice pretty big changes in our environment because we're paying attention to something else is a phenomenon known as change blindness. On this slide, you'll find links to several video clips that provide some entertaining examples of change blindness in action. Two of these links, the door study and the monkey business illusion, are also found on the web page for this module. But the other links, if you're interested, can be seen by clicking on the link on this slide. So we don't always notice things that are just a little bit off if we're not attending carefully. For example, the pictures of giraffes that you see on this slide, at first glance, might not appear to have anything different or unique about them, but look at them for a little bit longer and you'll see the problem. So how do we do it? What types of models have psychologists come up with to explain the phenomenon of selective attention? The earliest models were known as filter models of attention. These are sometimes referred to as early selection models because the assumption is that very early in the perceptual process, we shut off certain channels. We filter everything out that isn't coming in from the channel that we've selected. In early experiments on the filter models of attention, subjects would engage in what's called a shadowing task. In a shadowing task, the subject sits there with a set of headphones on, and they have two different messages being played, one into the left ear and one into the right ear. And they are told to very specifically follow the message in one ear and ignore the message in the other ear. And while they're listening, they are supposed to recite out loud the message word for word that they're listening to. This provides evidence that the person really is listening to the message they're supposed to listen to. And so if I'm in a shadowing task, I would say, I am now listening to the message I am hearing in my left ear. And I'm saying it like that because that's how the voice of a person in a shadowing task sounds. It's very monotone. It's as if they're not processing the meaning of the words. And it's almost like the words going right in the ear and out the mouth without stopping at the brain first. Now, the early studies on filter models were sort of promising and supportive because you found that people could shadow the task pretty well, but if you asked them about information that came in from the other channel, the other ear that they weren't listening to, they couldn't tell you anything. They couldn't tell you what language it is in. They couldn't tell if the speech was reversed. They couldn't tell you anything that they heard. They might be able to notice some big obvious change, like the voice changing from a male voice to a female female voice, excuse me. But even then, that doesn't always get picked up. So at first, filter models look pretty good. I can't get into the details in this class about why they got rid of filter models, but it turned out if you did the experiments in a somewhat different way, you could find out that information from the unattended channel was in fact getting through. And this could not happen if filter models or early selection models were the best way to understand selective attention. And so psychologists moved on to a different type of model. Currently, some form of what's called a capacity model of attention is the most widely accepted way of thinking about how selective attention works. There are many different capacity models of attention, and they differ from each other in one little detail or another. In this class, I'm just interested in having you know what a capacity model of attention is. So what I'm presenting in this slide is kind of a generic model of how capacity models of attention more or less work. Before I get into the details of the things in this diagram, however, I would like to explain something very important, and that's the relationship between attention and task performance. You'll notice in the square at the top of the diagram, the word arousal appears, and underneath it you see the words available capacity. Think of this square as the thing that's holding the amount of attention you have to give. This is the holding pen. Think of attention as a very limited resource. You can only parcel out so much of it before it's all gone. And you can divide it between different tasks, but you can't divide it infinitely. There is only so much to give. Well, one of the effects of arousal is that it decreases the amount of attention that a person can pay to a task. So if you think about that line right above the words available capacity as crushing down on capacity as arousal gets higher. The more arousal you have, the less capacity you have to give. And that's why things that you might be able to do very easily when you're not highly aroused can become very difficult when arousal levels are high. I always use the example in my classroom of putting a balance beam on the floor, like a big 2x4 piece of lumber, and it's just laying there on the carpet. And if I were to ask students to volunteer to come up and walk on this balance beam, I would find that most of them would probably do pretty well, and they'd walk down the beam and they wouldn't fall off. And yet, if I stretch that very same balance beam from one wing on the roof of the science building to another so that it's suspended about 60 feet off the ground, and now I ask people to walk across that balance beam, you'd find students falling to their death right and left, even though it's the very same task. What's the difference? Well, arousal levels are a lot higher in the second case than they are in the first case, and this interferes with your ability to attend to the task at hand. One of the oldest and best understood laws in psychology is something known as the performance arousal curve. If you look at the graph on this slide, the vertical axis represents performance. With the higher you are on it, the better your performance is. On the horizontal axis, the x-axis, is the amount of arousal, ranging from very low to very high. Well, you'll notice on a typical task, there is some level of arousal that's optimal. There's some level of arousal that is going to cause you to perform at your best. If your arousal levels are too low, your performance isn't going to be very good. If your arousal levels are too high, your performance is going to suffer as well. Think of this in a very concrete way. Imagine an athlete or a performer, like a singer or someone who needs to go out and perform in front of an audience or a crowd in a situation where there's a lot on the line, and their arousal levels should be just right. And this is what athletes and performers do to get themselves in the zone. We have all kinds of words for it. Psyching themselves up, but not wanting to psych themselves out. Coaches are, good coaches at least, are skillful at getting their athletes' level of arousal right where it needs to be. They give pep talks and they try to inspire good performance. Because if you go out there as a singer or an athlete and you're not aroused at all and you're yawning, your performance is going to be really lackluster. And if it's a competition of some sort, you're going to get slaughtered by the opposition whose arousal levels are just right. On the other hand, if your arousal levels are super high, you're petrified, you're terrified, this can be paralyzing and your performance is going to suffer as well. So there's this level of arousal that's just right. Now, the reason performance suffers when arousal levels get too high is because the amount of attention that you can pay to them suffers, because attentional capacity is decreased by high arousal levels. So what determines what the optimal level of arousal is? How do we know where just the right amount is to produce the best performance? Well, the answer to that question depends upon how simple the task is. And by simple, I mean how simple is it for you, the person performing the action? If it's a real simple task that anybody can do, or if it's a task that you've been doing for a long time and you're really good at it, your arousal levels can be quite high and your performance will still be quite good. On the other hand, if it's a brand new task or something very complicated, even low levels of arousal can disrupt it. And to get you to think about this, in my class, I often ask my students to remember the very first time you got behind the wheel of a car to drive. And I mean the very first time. Your hands are gripping the steering wheel and your eyes are locked on the road in front of you, and you're very tense and stiff. And you start driving the car, and if there's a person in the car with you who starts talking to you, you say, shut up, because you are so preoccupied with the task at hand that every ounce of attention that you have available is devoted to it. Now fast forward a year, when driving has become a much more simple task for you because you've done it a lot and it's well learned. And now if I were to watch you driving, I'd see you cranking up the music and singing along, having conversations with people in the car with you, maybe glancing at your phone and texting when you shouldn't be doing that. Because now the task is simpler for you, it's well learned, and it doesn't require as much of your conscious attention as it once did. This is the rationale behind rehearsal and practice. Athletes and performers want to learn something so well that when they get out there in a highly arousing situation to perform, the task is automatic. So automatic processing is the goal of rehearsal. You want to be able to process information and respond to it without having to allocate any conscious attention at all. There are two types of rehearsal. One is what you need to do to learn how to do the task. But the other kind of practice comes from making the task automatic. I coached wrestling for a long time, and sometimes my athletes would get bored drilling the same move over and over again. Coach, why do we have to do this? I know how to do this. Yes, you know how to do it, but is it automatic? Will you do it in a split second in competition when arousal levels are high, when you don't have any allocation of attention left? So that's the goal of performance. And so high arousal levels can disrupt tasks that aren't very simple or well learned. To illustrate how levels of arousal can influence your ability to perform a task, I'm going to ask you to watch a video that you can see by clicking on the picture on this slide, or you can also watch it by clicking on the link on the web page that goes along with this module. This video is a very entertaining but sobering look at what people do with guns when there's a situation of high pressure. One of the rationales for having people carry guns is that you've got a good guy in a situation who can use the gun to take out the bad guy and save lives. And in theory, this sounds great, but it overlooks the effects of adrenaline. It overlooks how people will actually perform in situations of high arousal. So just take a look at the video, and I think it'll be very memorable and it will help you understand exactly what I've been talking about. So let's return to our diagram of the capacity models of attention. So far we've just started off with how much of attentional capacity do we have. And this is determined to some extent by how high your arousal levels are. But however much attention you have to give, there has to be something called the allocation policy. How does your brain decide which activities or which stimuli are going to receive attention. And there are a lot of different things that can weigh in on this decision. If you look at the circles that point at the allocation policy, these are examples. Enduring dispositions. There are some things that by their very nature force you to pay attention to them. Sudden motion or something very new in your environment draws your attention in a way that you can't stop it. You can't look away. Hearing your name called in the distance draws your attention. Watching other people focus on something makes us want to look at it too. There's an interesting demonstration that some psychologists have used where you get a group of people to stare at something, maybe something up on the roof of a building, and they look and they look and they point. All the passersby stop and take a look at what they're looking at. And if I were to ask you to walk by them, even if you knew that this was a fake situation, there was nothing up there to look at, that these people are just part of the demonstration, you would feel this irresistible urge to turn your neck and look. Your eyeballs will start moving in that direction. Other people paying attention to something is a powerful signal to us that maybe there's something we should be paying attention to as well. The circle that says momentary intentions, on the other hand, means you can consciously decide, all right now, for this moment, I'm going to allocate attention to this task, even if it isn't fascinating. So you're listening to this PowerPoint slideshow right now, when there are lots of other things you probably could be doing that would be more interesting. So you can take that attention and force yourself to give it where it needs to be. Evaluation of demands on capacity simply means that you figure out how much attention a task needs and you allocate it accordingly. So things that need a lot of attention will get more than things that don't. Circling back to enduring dispositions once again, I'd like to remind you that sudden motion in your environment almost always attracts attention because things moving quickly around you were potential threats that we had to monitor. And so a flashing light running up and down the wall of the room for a while will attract your attention, even though you know that it doesn't mean anything. The lab exercise for this module is an example of one of those rare tasks where automatic processing actually interferes with your ability to perform the task. You'll read all about this and see some instructions for how to do the task by going to the webpage for the module, but very briefly, let me tell you what the Stroop effect is. You're asked to read across a screen that has the names of colors written in colored ink. You're supposed to not read the word. You're supposed to say what the color of the ink is. And this is an easy task if the color of the ink matches the name of the word. So for example, if the word green is written in green ink, you have no problem with the task. But if the word green is written in blue ink, and your task is to say what the color of the ink is, you automatically process the meaning of the word, and this interferes with your ability to name the color of the ink. So psychologists really had to do a little creative thinking to come up with a task where the automatic processing interferes with the ability to perform. But that's what the Stroop effect is all about, and I hope you have some fun with it in the lab for this course, for this module in the course.